Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. If you woke up today wondering, what is Slater going to talk about on his TV show? If you were thinking, how about epic takedown of 1700s French philosophers, you win! That's what we're going to do for half an hour. Buckle up. We're going to talk about how Jean-Jacques Rousseau, specifically his philosophy and how he screwed up everything, specifically our education system today. So, first background question before we get here. First, how is the world broken? There's two schools of thought on this. Obviously, there's more, but for the sake of time, there's two main schools of thought. The first says that corruption originates inside of us. The second thought says that the social structures corrupt us from the outside. Your answer to that question, right? How you feel to that question right there, I can pinpoint if you're a conservative or a progressive with almost perfect accuracy. How you answer that question can almost entirely determine if you're a conservative or a progressive. Ben Sass, his book, The Vanishing American Adult, excellent book. He has a great overview of these two different philosophies. He calls them the realist view and the romantic view. So let's do this real quick. The realist view, that's me, you realize the brokenness and the sinfulness of each man, yourself included. And because of that internal brokenness, therefore, you then go do bad and sinful things. So our goal in life, in the Christian view, is to die to self. You deny yourself. You pick up your cross daily so that you can live a good life. The other view is the romantic view of the world and of nature. Enter Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, one of the most influential philosophers till today, certainly top five. French guy, died in 1778. He's known as the father of the French Revolution, which is not a good thing to be the father of. Robespierre said that Rousseau is the one man who, through the loftiness of his soul and the grandeur of his character, showed himself worthy of the role of teacher of mankind. Again, you don't really want accolades from Robespierre. Rousseau rejected the realist view of man. He said that the bad things we do, they don't come from inside of us. It's the social external factors that make us bad. His famous quote is, "Everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things, and everything degenerates in the hands of man." Children, therefore, are born good and sweet and innocent, and it is society that corrupts them as they get older. These are two completely different views of human nature. And for today's show, we're going to focus on how that affects children and raising children in particular in our education system. If you take the realist view, which again I do, I see my kids do the wrong thing. They're 4 months, 2 and 3. And I see them do the wrong things. They hit, have a tantrum, scream when they don't get what they want, whatever. And I know Proverbs 22:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child. And it is my and my wife's job to unfolly them, to train them the way that they should go, to discipline and to reward and shape and mold our children into properly functioning adults. Right? That's the realist view. If you have the realist view, that's how you view your role as a parent. If you believe the romantic view of parenting, then you believe that the kids are just perfect. And you just need to let them be. You need to free children from the oppressive chains of parenting and of child rearing. And you need to let your child emerge as the beautiful butterfly that they inherently are. I think we've all seen this beautiful butterfly before, kicking and screaming in the aisles of Target. And we've seen that parent doing their wonderful, Johnny, please stop screaming bloody murder. Oh, Johnny, sorry, he's so sweet. Normally, he's such a sweet boy. Okay, Johnny, here's your toy. Please stop. That's the romantic view. So that's the first dot, Rousseau. The second dot to connect us today is John Dewey, 1952. The New York Times in 1952 called him America's foremost philosopher. He is the father of the modern public school system. He took the Rousseauian model and built the public school system as we know it and love it today. He was the head of Columbia's Teachers College. So he is the guy, the most important single figure of how we educate our kids today. And he got his entire philosophy of education from Rousseau. Cool? 4 minutes. Keep it going. Who was Rousseau? Who is this guy that we are taking our child rearing and educational advice from? Quick bio. Rousseau came from a very wealthy and powerful family, so he always thought that he himself was hot stuff. rich, privileged, wasn't successful at anything ever. He tried at least and failed at 13 jobs. At one job, he was the secretary to the French ambassador to Venice. And that guy said that Rousseau was doomed to poverty on account of his vile disposition, his unspeakable insolence, this is rude, the product of his insanity and high opinion of himself, all right? Never got along with anyone and always claimed he was persecuted, right? Same thing with people today, right? People always like, oh, person discriminating. No, maybe you're just a miserable person and no one wants to be around you. Could that possibly be true? Or is it always you, the victim? He would constantly whine about physical pains and emotional torment, but he was fine. He did have and he talked about this all the time, he did have a deformed penis. So that's true, but he wasn't in any other physical pain. He would have dreams about being in a group of women and not being able to control his going number one. So that, I guess, did cause him torment. Whined about being a victim all the time in order to elicit sympathy, especially from women, and it worked, just like it does today. Arrogant, conceited, unlike anyone you've ever met. He said, no one ever has had a more loving heart. No one's more tender and sensitive. Show me a better man than me, one of his lines. He was such an amazing person. He never hated anyone or anything ever. He never had any negative emotions towards anyone. He was a friend of all mankind. He was manipulative and paranoid. He thought there was a huge international conspiracy out to get them. There wasn't. He thought everyone was trying to manipulate him, so he would manipulate them first. He was also an exhibitionist. He would go around and flash women randomly on the streets of Paris. He would masturbate everywhere all the time. He was just a deviant. He was like Harvey Weinstein. With his family, he only saw money. Same thing with Karl Marx, as we talked about last week. He could not wait for people to die so he could get some money. But he was cheap and stingy. When his parents died when he was relatively young. So another woman, older woman, raised him. And when she was sick and dying, he never gave her any money and never visited her. And she spent her last 2 years bedridden and alone, and he did nothing. Here we got some quotes from some contemporaries of his. David Hume said, Rousseau was a monster who saw himself as the only important being in the universe. Diderot called him deceitful, vain as Satan, ungrateful, cruel, hypocritical, and full of malice. Grim, odious monster. Voltaire called him a monster of vanity and violence. What's up? All these people are calling him a monster, right? These are his contemporaries who aren't just like, yeah, I don't care for him. Not really first-class guy, I guess, or like he's okay. They call him a monster. They're all calling him a monster. His wife's last words were, I have nothing left for you but pity. Okay? This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Have you heard about Rousseau? We've all heard the name Rousseau. I don't know what you think. I don't know, it's like got a cool name. So it's Rousseau, Rousseau. It must be a great guy. He's a monster. He married this woman sort of and abused her. Emotionally, people would come over and he wouldn't let her sit down. He mocked her openly. He was cruel to her. Everyone knew it at the time. Now, here's the thing I'm building up to. He wrote a book called, people pronounce it Emile, E-M-I-L-E. It's got an accent on the end. Looks like Emily to me, but I don't know the French pronunciation, maybe Emile, whatever. It's called Emile, or I think it's a treatise on education. And it's a book about how to raise and educate children from this guy. Now, you're saying, all right, Slater, hold on. Maybe he wasn't a good husband. Maybe he was a terrible friend. Maybe he was a monster to everyone. But maybe he loved children. And he just had some sort of connection with children that was beautiful and wholesome and something that we should learn from and implement today. Okay, fair enough. Take a quick break, come back, and we'll talk about his relationship with children, in particular, his children. And then you can decide whether or not this is someone that you would like to take child rearing and child education advice from. Because the system we have today is based off of Rousseau and this book. We'll talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. Now I know you're thinking, Slater, all right, laying it on a little thick. Odious monster, vile monster. Slow your roll, Slater. Maybe he was great with children. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we're talking about, of course. Maybe he was great with children. So first of all, did he have any children? You know, this is a thing a lot, right? Like before I had kids and I'd talk about like a parenting thing, people were always like, oh, you don't have any kids, you don't know what you're talking about. And now I do have kids and people are like, well, you don't have a 14-year-old, you don't know what you're, okay, fine. So did Rousseau have kids? Yes, he did indeed have children. Okay, so you can check that box off. He did have kids, so he must have known what he was talking about, right? Little detail about his kids. He actually had 5 of them. 5 kids. Thing is, he forced his sort of wife to drop each one of them off at the local orphanage on the day they were born. He never saw any of them. He never named them and never made note of the days they were born. He abandoned all 5 of his children at the orphanage, which at the time, 2/3 of the babies died in the first year. 14% survived to the age of 7, and the very few who did live on into adulthood were never anything other than beggars in the streets. That's Rousseau and his kids. So I just want to drive this home. Our public school system, the philosophical lens, the philosophical foundation that we look at children and the education system that we formed comes from a guy who abandoned, and you could very clearly say, again, 2/3 of them died within the first year, killed all 5 of his children. Who is going to listen to that guy? And the answer is everyone. All of America is listening to that guy. Or I guess more specifically, the influential thinkers from the 50s who then went on to build the system that we have today. It's amazing to me. We built this country, regardless of what the social justice warriors say, we built this country on the backs of great men with noble ideas. But we've built modern society off the backs of wicked and cruel people with terrible ideas, as we talked about with Marx last week. Now, let's take it to the next level. Why did Rousseau abandon all 5 of his kids? Okay. So, like all narcissists, it's never their fault. It's always someone else's fault. Always is. So, first person to blame, it was all the other intellectuals that he dealt with who even put the idea in his head in the first place. No loving, amazing, innocent, even Christ-like soul like his would ever even have conceived of such an idea of abandoning his kid at the orphanage. But some other intellectual brought it up, and that's when it entered his mind, and then did it 5 times. He then said that having children would be an inconvenience to him. He said he could not afford it. He had this great line later. He said, "How could I achieve the tranquility of mind necessary for my work with little rugrats running around?" And then my favorite is, he said, "I know full well no father is more tender than I would have been. But he abandoned his children because he didn't want his children to have any contact with their mother." So he was really helping his kids. He was saving his kids from their mother. But Rousseau, I mean, there's no father today that would have been as wonderful of a father as I would have been. Amazing. Let me share this quote too. "My ardent love of the great, the true, the beautiful, and the just, my horror of evil of every kind, my utter inability to hate or injure or even to think of it, the sweet and lively emotion which I feel at the sight of all that is virtuous, generous, and amiable," blah, 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 it goes on. What does quotes like this prove? This guy, other than like a psycho, he is in massive denial. He wrote that 20 years after he abandoned his first kid. Okay, talk about how wonderful of a person he is. So what did he do in response to this? I think the healthiest thing would be to take your shame and guilt and seek forgiveness and some sort of redemption somehow. Did he do that? Of course not. He's too much of a narcissist. He doubled down in that shame, justified it, and then, to our detriment, built an entire philosophy around it. So this is worse than hypocrisy, right? It's from Rousseau's cruelty and his inability to deal with it properly that we have our public school system. How? Slater, what's that dot? He went on to make the argument that parents shouldn't be raising their children. He said that parents should not be raising children on their own. He said the government should do it. That was one of the main points of his book on education, that the government should raise kids. Do you see? This was a self-justification of his own evil behavior. His philosophy is a self-justification simply because he knew what he did was wrong. So he turned it into an entire philosophy and conviction that what he did was actually right and proper. And you should too. You too should abandon your children and let the government raise them. See that? He abandons his kids at the orphanage. And instead of acknowledging, gee, that probably wasn't a great thing to do, he said everyone should abandon their kids at the orphanage or the local government school, the state. And then he went a step further and said the state shouldn't just be forming the minds of children as he so nobly let the state take over his children. But the state should also be in charge of forming the minds of adults. And here we have the rise of the future totalitarian state. The state is the father, the patriae, which installs the morals, or instills the morals in the people, and the people are nothing but the children, right? So father, children, state, people. See, that's his philosophy. He said the state should possess men and all their powers. His original oath that he said people should take is, I join myself, body, goods, and will, and all my powers to the Corsican nation, granting her ownership of me, of myself, and all who depend on me. That's super creepy. But that's what he had to do in order to justify what he did with his kids. So let's connect a few more dots. So there's I would say two, but there's three direct, super clear examples of the ramifications of this. So the first is the French Revolution, right? Which again, he's known as the father of, which is not a good thing to be known as the father. So that's the first one. The second one is Cambodia. Pol Pot was the leader of Cambodia. The communist there, that guy, he was a leader from 75 to 79. He killed around 2 million people. It was between a fifth and a third of the entire country he murdered, give or take. Cambodia was a colony of what country? France. All the leaders in Cambodia were educated in Paris or in Cambodia under French philosophy. Pol Pot himself, he went to the best schools in Cambodia. I remember all these dictators are like from rich families, right? So Pol Pot went to the best schools in Cambodia, mostly with kids of French bureaucrats. After the war, he spent 3 years in Paris. He also spent time in Marxist Yugoslavia. And when he was in Paris, his favorite author became Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He literally joined a Marxist group in Paris, went back to Cambodia, yada, 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 killed 2 million people. Okay, so that's a pretty clear line from Rousseauian and Marx thinking to Pol Pot, to the murder of two, right? I think the next clearest example is our education system. The state's in charge, right? The state, not the family, not the church, certainly, no religion, right? So the state is best at raising our children and instilling virtue in them. Also this idea, and this is Rousseau and John Dewey, that the school needs to be the center of a child's entire existence and social life. I remember when I first read that a while back, that really struck me because I've only known that. That was true for me growing up, and that's all I've ever known. I thought that's how it's always been. That the school, this government building, is the center of a child's existence. We drop them off there every morning. They stay all day, and then later, even in some cases, and then just come home for a brief rest, and then back to right. Everything that their life is in the school. That's the center of their education and their social life as well. That's not normal. Like that's a new thing. As opposed to the family, which used to be the center of a child's life, obviously. And then you have the third thing, which is the kid knows best, right? Let the kids be. They're perfect just the way they are. They don't need any real teaching or training or instruction or discipline. Just let them evolve on their own. And anything that we, the adults, do is a corrupting influence and force on them. So that's all Rousseauian garbage. Reject that system. Don't play a role in it anymore. Don't play a role. COVID actually is a blessing for this, because it gives everyone an opportunity to do something different, right? I know you're probably thinking like, and I get this, you want your kids to have a public school experience because you did, and you want them to have pep rallies and football games on Friday nights and blah, 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 right? That's not a thing anymore. So you're not missing out on that. Do something different. Go back to the old, where Mao wanted to get rid of the four olds. They called them the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. I want to go back to them. I want to go back to all the olds. I'll end with this nice little quote from Rousseau. Those who control a people's opinions control its actions. And such control is established by treating citizens from infancy as children of the state, trained to consider themselves only in their relationship to the body of the state. Okay, so government, the father, trains people as infants and as children for the purpose of benefiting the government. So that's Mussolini, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And that is our education system today. Thanks a lot, Rousseau. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. All right, Slater Crusaders. We just spent a half an hour bad-mouthing Rousseau. Let's take a deep breath and go to someone much smarter than me and talk about what is true and what our country was founded on for good, as opposed to our education system being founded on Rousseauian philosophy. David Azerrad is a professor at Hillsdale College. Professor, how are you, sir?
Good morning, Mike.
I'm really glad you're here. So, again, we just talked about Rousseau forever. Let's talk about what our country was founded on. So who and what philosophies were we founded on and that are rooted in truth that we need to be getting back to?
Well, I would say on the founders' principles, which are articulated with the greatest clarity in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. But then you also find them in the other major documents of the founding. I think when we look at the founding, it's a mistake to want to go to the private side of Jefferson's letters right away. I think we should begin with public documents that were adopted by legislatures. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Massachusetts Constitutions. And across these documents, you see a set of self-evident truth, the axioms that our ancestors founded this country upon. The natural rights philosophy that was derived in part from the philosophy of John Locke, the British Enlightenment thinker. But I think it's a mistake to want to look behind America too quickly. That is not to deny that there was an influence. But what the founders did was, in a sense, unique. That yes, they drew from Locke and they drew from Montesquieu and from Blackstone and from the Bible. But they ultimately did a unique synthesis of these principles that is uniquely American.
How so? Give me some example. Give me an example of something that we took a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put these ingredients together and made a beautiful thing.
Well, so clearly we took the idea of natural rights and government by consent from John Locke. There are that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is really a summation of Locke's second treatise, and there are two passages in the Declaration that Jefferson literally lifted from Locke. I mean, that are plagiarized. The term long train of abuses and usurpations, for example. That being said, Locke had much less room for Christianity in his political order than the founders ended up having. And so Locke was not anti-Christian, he was not radically secular, but his is a much more neutered Christianity. So for example, Locke forbids any establishment of religion. The founders did not at the state level. So we're not allowed at the federal level, but it was permitted at the state level. And so here's an instance of them drawing from two different sources. Now, at the end of the day, I will say that the governing principle, I think, was natural rights under natural law. I think that was in this amalgam of different traditions, the British common law, Christianity, I really think that natural rights was the overarching principle that guided the whole.
And can you define those for us? And I ask you this only because, I'm curious, and I think all of us need to be able to describe these things as articulately and as top of mind now more than ever in order to fight back against the Marxist philosophies of today. So what are natural rights?
Well, I mean, we should memorize, all Americans should know the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence off by heart, because it's not just our forefathers who held these truths to be self-evident. We too, as contemporary Americans, should also hold them to be self-evident. Yeah. And the teaching is simple, that by nature, by birth, there is no natural hierarchy in human beings. There are no superior races, inferior races, no superior religions, inferior religions. All human beings, regardless of the accidents of birth, regardless of all of the categories that obsess us today, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, you name it, none of that gives any one person or group of people a right to rule other human beings against their consent. That's what equality means. It doesn't mean we're all equally intelligent, equally good-looking, successful, tall, fast, famous. All it means is that no one can rule you without your consent. The only two exceptions are actually, that's a good way to think about it, are children and the mentally disabled. These are two groups of people who get ruled without their consent because they do not yet possess the faculty of reason. But if you're a human being, a normal adult human being, you possess the faculty of reason, it means that you can be held morally responsible for your actions. And as such, you cannot be ruled against your consent. Another way to think about it is that we all possess the same core inalienable rights. The Declaration of Independence says that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Other founding era documents speak of the right to freely worship God, of the right to acquire and possess property, of the right to travel freely. There are other rights that come there, but the idea is the same, is that we all possess the same rights simply by virtue of being human beings. That's the bedrock principle.
Okay, what was that in reaction to? So what existed before that? Because again, I've been kind of I've lived in this system my entire life. So what alternatives were there that this was such a revolutionary idea?
Well, one alternative would be that certain people called kings and aristocrats, by birth, they have blue blood, they're nobles, and they have certain privileges. You know, we talk a lot about privilege today in society in a very stupid, meaningless way, as if the law grants certain privileges to groups of people, which is nonsense. But that's the way Europe was set up. There were noblemen, and they possessed certain privileges that common people did not possess, all the way up to the king. So it's a reaction against that. And I should add, you don't need to go back 300 years. Look at where we are today with identity politics. We're in effect saying, now thankfully it's still not codified into law, that certain groups are bad, people who look like you, Mike, white men, and that they should be punished, and that other groups, people of color, women, I mean, you know the roster of the aggrieved, that they're oppressed, and therefore they're entitled to more honor and special privileges under the law. So what we're seeing today is clearly not the old European system, but it is just as much an assault on the idea that in America, as far as the law goes, these categories don't exist. The only meaningful category is the distinction between adult and children, between men and women, because there are biological differences. I don't think in a sane regime we should be sending women into battle. And third, there should be a distinction between Americans and non-citizens, that it is perfectly legitimate to have certain privileges of citizenship that we not bestow upon foreigners. But beyond that, the government should not be classifying citizens by race, by religion, by all of the categories that obsess us today.
Yeah, that's true equality. Okay, actually, let me focus on equality. When did equality become that, as you described it, into whatever perverted definition we have today, which is everything has to be equal all the time?
Well, look, in a sense, that grows out of Marxist ideas. So the founders' regime has been assaulted since the middle of the 19th century. I mean, there have been successive waves of alternative political theories that reject the Declaration of Independence philosophy. So first you had Calhoun and the philosophy that led the way to secession that actually said, no, there are master races and inferior races. Now, that was disposed of during the Civil War. Then you had the progressives who came along at the late 19th, early 20th century and said, yeah, there are actually superior races, but it's not biological, it's because of civilizational development. And that whites are a superior race and they have a duty to colonize the rest of the world and to elevate mankind to civilization. So they didn't infer from that a title to rule despotically, but rather a title to rule benevolently to elevate others. And then you get the 1960s with the New Left and the beginnings of identity politics that come to America, radical feminism, Black power, Black nationalism, that start to posit that the fundamental unit is not the individual, but the identity group. And that then sets up this hierarchy of groups from the more oppressed you are, it turns out the more privileges you get, and the more privileged you supposedly are, the more the less well you're treated. And this is what we're living with today, is a working out of the identity politics that develops in America in the late 60s, early 70s.
Wow, that's so amazing. I'm so glad you mapped out the different iterations of that in the last 150 years or so. You're right, it comes from different attacks from different angles, but all of them perverted versions of equality. So again, help me one more time. What is the true definition of equality based off of our founding and slash Enlightenment principles?
The true definition is that no one person or group of people has, either by nature or by God, a right to rule others without their consent. There's no superior caste, superior race, blue blood, a superior tribe who are entitled to rule the rest of human beings without their consent.
Does that leave open the possibility that a group or a race could be inferior or superior to another's, even if they don't rule over the other? Well, does that still imply that? Go ahead.
I mean, it doesn't mean that all human beings are the same. Some groups will have, more developed in such a way that they have more civilizational accomplishments. Some groups were going to be stronger. Others will be more intelligent. Some groups are going to claim, most of them will do that their religion is the one true religion and that everyone else's religion is wrong. But the founders' philosophy is none of that gives you a political title to rule over others. None of that negates the fundamental equality of natural rights. Now, one thing to keep in mind that I want to emphasize is, all human beings are equal in that sense, but then we separate into political communities. We set ourselves apart from the rest of mankind. Now, that doesn't mean that therefore then we're allowed to go rule the rest of mankind, of course not. But it means that we can govern ourselves as we see fit. We then control our borders. So as Americans, we don't need to let in all of humanity on the grounds that all human beings are equal. We formed a political community. We control our territory. We govern ourselves as we see fit. But it does mean that for ourselves, for our fellow Americans, we can't begin to bestow special privileges under the law. That you can't have a caste system in America.
Yeah, very good. Professor, we got to take a break. Can you stick around for one more quick segment?
Yes, sir.
We have much more to do. Professor David Azerrad from Hillsdale College. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Study Crusaders, I'm so grateful for the professor. I don't want to let him go. So he's gracious enough to stick around. Professor David Azerrad from Hillsdale College, the great Hillsdale College, which I hope out of this, I hope it's so obvious to everyone that the universities are just completely failed states and need to go away. And Hillsdale will continue to be a beacon and emerge, hopefully, as the leader in the university system. I hope so. All right, Professor. So you did this great thing about you can't rule over another people except for children and the mentally disabled because they don't have their faculties to reason properly yet. So as adults who can reason or have the ability to reason, whether or not we do, what are our responsibilities in this free system then?
Well, I mean, I would think of it in terms of concentric circles, that you have an individual who is part of a family, who is part of a community, who is part of a country, who belongs to the human race. And the farther out you go, the fewer responsibilities you have. So you have greater responsibilities to your family than you do to your community. And in a sense, greater responsibilities to help, for example, the poor in your community than you do the poor in America, than you do the poor in Africa. And think of it today, the governing logic of our elites is a very odd thing where we're responsible for the whole of humanity, which allows us to completely ignore those around us. So if you go to the, very nice coastal cities where the wealthy, credentialed, successful people live, they're filled with homelessness, with mental illness, with broken families. But don't worry about it. Our elites are good people because they support AIDS programs in Malawi, or because they're sending money to Thailand for an after-school program for little girls. So we have it all wrong. I'm not saying, I want to make clear, we should not care about the rest of humanity, but you have stronger responsibility to care for those right next to you and your fellow countrymen than you do for the rest of mankind. This is something we have a hard time grasping today. I think our elites think that what I just said is racist. Well, hold on one second. What are you saying? We should like Americans more than Africans and Thai people? Yes. Doesn't mean that you need to hate Africans and Asians and the rest of humanity, but you should love your fellow citizens more than you do the rest of humanity. I don't think that should be a controversial proposition. But the left starts to panic when they hear this language. They say, oh, hold on. You're saying I should love them more, and therefore you're saying they're better, and therefore Hitler. That's the way that the mind nets up working, which is nonsense.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, I see progressives, they claim to be like, we're world citizens, right? And that's always first. So their concentric circles move backwards.
Yeah, by the way, and then Mike, they're world citizens until they get detained by the police in Bangladesh, and then they call the U.S. embassy. Trust me.
And you gave them a lot of credit by suggesting someone actually does donate to a children's school in wherever, as opposed to just saying one should. Yeah, you're right. Well, so they say they're a world citizen, and then hate the country, ignore the community, break down the family. And they themselves are miserable individuals. So that they're backwards and broken.
Yeah, let me put it to you this way. Setting aside Donald Trump for one moment. I mean, if you're not going to put America first as an American citizen, Not as in your private life. In your private life, you should put your family, your faith. But as a citizen, yeah, you should put America and Americans first. Well, what are you going to put first? You can't put humanity first. I mean, that really is, it's not possible to do that. It's too vast, too amorphous. So what you end up doing is you put yourself first.
Yes.
You end up leading a rather solipsistic, self-absorbed existence that is, repackaged with this highfalutin language about I'm here to make the world a better place, but the world is too big. You can't grasp it. And so you end up turning back upon yourself and being rather self-absorbed. And this is a lot of what we see. These people who claim to be global citizens, to think about humanity and not their countries. Not all of them, but many of them I've found tend to be quite self-absorbed.
Yeah, well, I think Rousseau is a good example of that in the first half hour of the show. Okay, so as an individual, what are some of these most important virtues that you would advocate for today that we need to get back to? Responsibilities, even.
Yeah, I'd say, look, when the founders talked about public virtues, citizen virtues, I think they would, broadly speaking, put them in two different buckets. One are the peaceable virtues, the virtues that allow us to get along with one another. Moderation, self-restraint, hard work, the virtues of industriousness that allow America to function and to have a growing economy. But then there's another set of virtues, the self-assertive virtues, the manly virtues of courage. One extreme of that is going to be on the battlefield, that you may be called upon to defend and maybe die for your country. But, in a much more pedestrian way, perhaps, you need citizens who will defend their rights. One thing we forget is that talk is cheap. It's very easy to proclaim rights. Everyone does it. I mean, read the Syrian constitution if you want to see some beautiful proclamations of rights. At the end of the day, it's not the proclamation that matters. Are you going to have an assertive citizenry that will push back when the rights are encroached upon by the state, which will inevitably happen? So my favorite line of the Declaration of Independence is the fifth grievance leveled against the king, that he has dissolved houses of assembly repeatedly. Why? Because they opposed with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Wow. That, to me, is what makes an American an American. Of course, you know your rights, but then also, when they are encroached upon, you push back. Now, that doesn't mean that you take your guns and you storm the city hall and then the right to revolution is a last recourse. But that the citizens must make themselves heard. They should not tolerate their rights being abused.
Amazing, Professor. We got about 2 minutes. What is the end, or the next iteration, perhaps, of this identity politics woke cult that we have right now, as you see it? Where are we going with this, if we allow it, if we don't push back with manly firmness?
I mean, I see three things that they want. One is the criminalization of hate speech, which you think, well, why should we allow people to use the N-word or to deny the Holocaust? That's not what hate speech to them means. Hate speech means you can't talk about immigration. You can't talk about welfare reform. You cannot have self-government because everything is racist. So right now we have the media and big tech and private corporations and your employer that will punish you if you don't say the right thing, which is very bad, by the way. But for the time being, at least the government doesn't do so. I think they want to go there. Second, they want reparations for slavery. And this idea is gaining steam. So to have one group pay another group. And let's be clear, the moment the check is issued, they will immediately say that wasn't enough, we need round two. And third is, I think they want an intensification of what we already have, which is even though our laws are colorblind, in their application in the private sector, there is rampant discrimination. There is discrimination in favor of women and African Americans and against men, white people, and Asians. Even though this is forbidden by the law, the private sector does it, the government does it, and the courts have blessed it. And I think they want more of that. And that is fundamentally un-American.
Professor, 30 seconds. What is Hillsdale College about? Why is Hillsdale College a beacon?
It is one of the very, very few intellectually and morally serious universities in America. It is one of the very few universities whose primary mission is not rankings, football, fundraising, diversity, social justice, activism. Rather, it is academic excellence, the great books of the Western tradition, and character formation.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. Intellectually and morally serious institution. So good. Professor Azerrad from the great Hillsdale. Professor, wonderful to talk to you, sir. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Love that. That's it. Show's over. Do it tomorrow. Do it again tomorrow. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.